Whenever I would start crying when I was a kid, my parents would say, "Stop crying or else Karabuncle is going to come get you. Karabuncle is coming to get you." Karab means bad in Kutchi, which is an Indian dialect. Karabuncle means bad guy. Looking back on this, I always laugh because I just think about how funny it is that even though this was a bad guy, my parents called him an uncle, because disclaimer to brown parents, every single adult is either an uncle or an auntie. So I shouldn't really have been surprised. Anyways, I have a very distinct memory from my childhood of when I was sitting on the old carpet in our townhome in Burnaby, and I was sitting on top of the warm heater vent and peering outside looking onto the street. And my teary eyes were further blurred by the raindrops on the window. And I remember quite vividly seeing a car pull up into our driveway. It was a white car, and I remember my heart started to race, and I thought, oh no, Karabuncle really is coming to get me. I really did think that. And it turned out that the car just turned around and went the other way. I guess it had been going somewhere else. But it's a small thing, but when I think about it, this marks the beginning of the trajectory of fear in my narrative. And it started to get me to think about the other as something to be afraid of, as something that I needed to fear. As I grew older and faced the prospect of independence, my parents weren't so comfortable with me taking the bus by myself. My dad would insist on driving me to my meetings and my events because he felt that I would be safer that way. And of course, this would get me to think, well, I guess there's something on the bus that I need to be afraid of. Maybe I should, stay away. Maybe I should keep my distance. I have an older brother, and that's a picture of us there. He's here today, actually. And so I noticed a pattern early in my life. I noticed that my parents would treat my brother very differently than how they would treat me. They would not be so concerned when he would take the bus alone, and they weren't as protective of him as they were of me, not nearly as protective. And it didn't feel good. It felt really unfair, actually. Drawing 2 X chromosomes from the lottery left me far from winning. I felt like I had to be afraid. I felt like I had to keep my guard up at all times, and it wasn't fair. At a young age, I was exposed to gender inequality, and I didn't like the weight of it, and so I would try to theorize ways for, why maybe that was the case, and it hadn't occurred to me yet that life is unfair, and so I would think, maybe, just maybe, in a Cyndi Lauper-esque way, maybe girls just have more fun at the end of it all, and so maybe it'll just end up adding up, and so it'll end up being pretty equal. But I don't know if it's true that girls have more fun, and even if it is, it doesn't quite reconcile the fact that so many of us have to live in fear. And so I wonder, is this fear that we experience, is it valid? Well, let's see. Absolutely. It's absolutely valid, and I cannot blame my parents for being so protective over me. But I'm not sure that living in fear is the best way that we can respond to this. And so I'm going to talk to you today about a story of a project that I started called 101 Days, 101 Strangers, 101 Stories, where for 101 consecutive days, I set out to meet a new stranger each day to learn about their story, about what drives them. And the thing is that when I started this project, it was never about making my community more safe and about making myself feel more safe. I actually came at it from a kind of backwards way. And so this was the project. And what actually inspired it was a few years ago, I had heard about a boy who spent his entire summer working a different job every single week. And I thought that was so cool. Imagine how much he learned about himself, about what he likes, about what he doesn't like, about what the lives of other people are like. And so this summer, I had a bit of free time. I was working a couple of contract jobs, but I had some free time to kill, and I wanted to start a project of my own. And so I reflected on what the kinds of things were that energized me in my life. And I came to the conclusion that it was the one-on-one conversations that I would have with people. So often, we ask each other, what do you do Where do you work? And we never really asked those big questions about, what do you love? What drives you? And I wanted to start asking more meaningful questions like this. And so I grew up as kind of a perfectionist. This is my last disclaimer, but I grew up as kind of a perfectionist where I'd like to plan these projects out, and I realized over time that through planning out projects meticulously, sometimes it prevents you from starting them at all. So I decided on a date. I said, July 1st, I'm just going to start this project. I don't know what it's going to look like, but I'm just going to do it. And so I did. So it turned out that on July 1st, I had just moved into a new building, and I had boxes everywhere, but I still wanted to stick to the date. And so I went and knocked on one of my neighbor's doors, and I told her about my project, and she was a little bit hesitant. I said, today's day one. Would you like to come over for tea? And she said, she was a bit hesitant, but she said sure, and she came over that evening, and we talked for almost 2 hours, and I learned so much from her. This is Rose. She's a janitor here at UBC. I've probably walked past her over 100 times without ever saying hello, and I'm really glad that I did. She's so much more than just a janitor. She told me about her childhood and how she grew up in the Philippines, and she lived in a village that didn't have electricity at the time. And the closest grocery store was hours away, so every couple of weeks she would go with her siblings, and she would carry food on top of her head to come home. And this was such an interesting story, and she talked about how she was really grateful for what she does have now, reflecting on that story. And I felt really inspired from this, and without having spoken to her, I would have never known this. This is Marshall. I met him, he's a waiter at one of the restaurants in Vancouver, and I was eating dinner with my friend, and I hadn't yet met my stranger of the day, and so I asked him, I said, I'm working on this project, will you be my stranger of the day? And before I even explained what it was, he said yes. He said, you don't even know what that entails. Are you sure that you want to be my stranger of the day? He said yes. I apologized and said, I know you're working, but anyways, he agreed to it. And so it was pretty funny, actually. Every time he would walk past our table, intermittently, he would drop a 5-second fact about himself. And the first one was that he hosts meditation sessions in his house. The second time he came around, he said that he used to work in the stock market and that he used to study business. And at the end of it all, I asked him if I could go maybe join one of the meditation sessions sometime. And he said sure, and I did, and it was amazing. Sometimes, just to give the backstory of this photo, sometimes I would go to events and would tell people about this project, and we would exchange contact information and meet up at a later date. And so Karen is one of these people who I exchanged contact information with. An amazing woman. She's a professional chef. So lucky me, I got to go to her Yaletown apartment, and she taught me how to bake scones. So we baked scones together, ate lunch, and I learned about her story and her life, and this was our breakfast. These are the scones, and she sent me this text afterward. Reminder to taste the world with your heart. So now I'm going to talk about some more of these stories, but I'm going to relate them back to some of the key reflections that I've drawn from working on this project. So this is Rebecca. I met with her here at UBC, actually, and one of the pieces of advice that she gave me, that's a question that I usually like to ask because people are so wise. We hear quotes all the time from people like Gandhi and Nelson Mandela, and these quotes are famous for a reason, but I think there's so much wisdom in the everyday person, so much relatable wisdom too. And so one of these pieces of wisdom from Rebecca was that we should never forget what it is that we loved to do when we were a child. And I loved that. I thought back to my own life, and my mom, she's told me about how apparently I used to like writing a lot, and I would write all of these books, but I would never finish writing them. So this project has been interesting because I've been documenting all of the stories on my blog, and it's been a way to keep myself accountable to writing the stories and finishing them. And I thought that was a really neat piece of advice. And I would encourage everyone here to think back about what those things were that you loved before being exposed to the world and grown-up life, and maybe even asking your parents, like, did I have any weird habits or hobbies when I was a kid? And I wonder if I still have those. This is Stepan. He is a very, very wise man. He used to relate his relationship with his wife. This was the story he told me. So he used to relate his relationship with his wife. He used to compare it to the relationships of his friends and their partners. And he found that in this process of comparing himself to other people, he wasn't really getting anywhere. It wasn't very productive. It didn't make him happier. And his biggest learning from it was that he realized it was actually an exercise in futility. To compare something so qualitative to something else that's also quite qualitative is really not a productive exercise. There's not much that you can learn from it. And I thought about why it is that maybe we don't approach strangers as much in our everyday. And I think part of it might be because of how much we compare ourselves to other people and how we keep ourselves in these boxes. Even on Facebook, when you see a profile picture and how many likes it has, it's kind of a way of quantifying this value that we have as people, and it compares it in that way, and in a way that tries to quantify it, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really mean anything. Now, this is Shamari, and this is a very interesting story. So I met Shamari on one of my off days. I had locked my bike to a fence, and I'd locked it in a place where I probably shouldn't have, and I was just coming back from work, and I was walking pretty briskly. I was afraid that it would have been stolen, and Shamari was sitting on his bike looking back towards me. And he looked kind of curious, and as I walked past, he kind of shouted out at me, and I felt kind of uncomfortable. But we were in a park, and it was broad daylight, and I thought, what is there really to lose if I engage in a conversation? And so he kind of followed me on his bike, and and I was talking to him. We were just having a conversation, and usually I would have booked it, but I decided, you know what? I'm going to have this conversation and see what happens, because I really have nothing to lose. And so we got to talking, and at one point in our conversation, he actually fell halfway off of his bike, and I was like, "Are you okay?" And he said, "I got lost in your eyes, sorry." And at this point, I was just feeling really uncomfortable. But now, fast track to the end of our conversation, he had mentioned things about, do you think that women in Vancouver are stuck up? Different things like this. And at the end of our conversation, we got to talking about how to treat people with respect. I told him that I felt uncomfortable with the way that he was talking to me, and we talked about the objectification of women, and he said, how can I approach people with more respect? I don't like that I made you feel uncomfortable, and I actually just wanted to have a conversation. And so it turned into this really, really rich learning experience. And so I thought, having these conversations, maybe this is a really important thing that I'm doing. And so now onto the topic of trust. I noticed a pattern throughout this project, which was that I think that being a woman made people feel like they could trust me more. And this might seem like a weird claim, but there's someone else who's working on a similar project here in Vancouver, actually, called the Stranger Project, which I found out about afterwards. And what's neat is that for his project, he approaches people and he documents them online as well. And he lists how many times it takes him before he gets to talk to a stranger who agrees to speak with him as well. And sometimes it's 5 or 6 or 7 people that he has to talk to beforehand. For me, there was only like 1.5 times where I got kind of a rejection from a stranger, but for the most part, people were always willing to speak with me. And so I drew a connection with this back to the story I was talking about with my brother, and how this fear that's instilled in our culture, it leaves women feeling afraid, and it leaves men feeling as though they're not worthy of trust. Now, these are big claims, and this is just generally speaking, but that is generally the case, I realized, and I thought, okay, so I can continue to live in fear in this way, or maybe there are ways in which I can have conversations and maybe slowly we can lift ourselves out of this in a different kind of way. Another theme was connection. And here in Vancouver, we're known for an enormous lack of it. Here are some headlines, some actual headlines. So Vancouver's known as a pretty lonely place. A lot of people don't actually know who their neighbors are, and it's not often that we get outside of our box and connect with people. One of my strangers mentioned that it's kind of a weird story, but I'll explain it. So we were standing, and he said, "Aliya, look beside you." So I did, and I was looking at the people walking past each other, and they weren't acknowledging one another, but their dogs would always acknowledge each other. You know, like you see dogs, and they always, like, they sniff each other, they do whatever they have to do, and they always acknowledge one another. And so I got to thinking, like, maybe this is a little bit silly, but I wonder, in our natural, unsocialized state, would we acknowledge each other more? I mean, how many of you have walked past someone on the street or been this person yourself to dart your eyes down or to see that they dart their eyes down and you don't have that eye contact or a smile and you don't share in that? If you've experienced that, put up your hand and say yes. Yes. And so I wonder if this is natural, if this is something that has just kind of come about through the ways that we've been socialized. And so these are just some of my hypotheses, but one of these ways in which perhaps we've been socialized, at least in my experience, is maybe through our school systems. So I've taken courses, I know many of the courses at UBC do work like this, where the grades are scaled, and so if you do better than the other people in your class, then the scale works in your favor. So you actually have an incentive to get other students to perform worse than you. It puts us against each other instead of getting us to work with one another. And so this is one of the ways in which we've been kind of put into these boxes. Another is our economic systems, perhaps, and how they're so individualistic. Today, we're experiencing some of the highest levels of wealth inequality that we've ever experienced before. The top wealthiest 85 people have the same amount of wealth as the bottom 50% in the world. We're living in this culture where we want more selflessly, and we're trying to accumulate all of this wealth for ourselves, and it's not really a collaborative process. So on day 101, I met a woman named Lynn. She was walking past me in the park, and I stopped and I asked her if she'd have a moment to talk, and she said, she took a step back, took a good look at me, and she said, "I guess I'd have a couple of minutes to talk." Half an hour later, we were still talking, and she was sharing with me a story from a time 30 years ago when a stranger had treated her with utmost kindness, a complete stranger, and she was reflecting on this moment in her life, and she was moved to tears of joy. She was moved to tears thinking about this kindness from a stranger. She was so vulnerable and open and completely wholeheartedly trusting me with this story. And so at the end of it all, there probably are some carabuncles out there when we're walking on the street, but I guarantee you that not everyone is one. And if we can feel more connected in our spaces, then we will feel safer, we will feel happier, we will feel more comfortable and more connected, less isolated. And I feel like if this is something that we can achieve by even just spreading a smile or a simple hello, then I think it's something that we should look into a little bit more. Thank you.